The Struggle to Vote, the Nation, Alabama, and the South, 1848 to 1920, a 19th Amendment Centennial project of the League of Women Voters of the Tennessee Valley, Huntsville, Alabama. Welcome to the first installment of a multi-part series on the 19th Amendment Centennial, the amendment that gave women the vote. This part will explore the period of 1848 to 1920. These programs are a survey of that struggle nationally and in the South, especially Alabama's role in history. It is also a complex story of the racial aspects of the struggle and how even today we are struggling to make sure every citizen has a fair chance to exercise their right to vote. Many women, activists or not, across all demographics, believed women should have more autonomy over their personal lives and outside the home, starting in the early days of the Republic. Married women were considered under the protection and authority of their husbands. They were considered to have lesser intelligence than men and to lack emotional maturity. They wanted such rights as property rights before marriage that were brought into marriage, to keep money earned independently before and during marriage, to have legal guardianship of their children on death or incapacitation of their husband, and representation in government if they paid taxes. Women of color wanted the same, plus fair protection from race-based laws. The suffrage movement came out of the abolitionist movement, reformist, and utopian societies of the early 19th century. The utopian communities of New Harmony, Brook Farm, and the Fruitlands promoted equality for all. However, the anti-slavery societies, the most numerous, allowed American women the unusual opportunity to be treated as equals with men. Several women as well as men headed anti-slavery societies, which gave them experience in organization, public speaking, and fundraising. In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had known each other from the anti-slavery movement, decided to call a meeting to discuss women's rights in their town of Seneca Falls, New York. Mott was a Quaker and early abolitionist from Philadelphia. Stanton grew up with parents who encouraged education for women and spent many hours in her radical cousin's home discussing various social reforms. As a young girl, she had cut out pieces of one of her father's law books citing anti-woman laws, thinking that this act would get rid of them. To everyone's surprise, over 300 men and women came to the meeting. A great many discussions took place, including those on property rights, divorce laws, and professional and educational access, on which most agreed. However, the right to vote was the most contentious. It split Mott, anti, against Stanton, pro. Of all the rights, voting was real power. It was said, many a man who advocated equality most eloquently for a Southern plantation could not tolerate it at his own fireside. The resolution for women's suffrage eventually passed and was published. Stanton also wrote her Declaration of Sentiments, basically rewriting the Declaration of Independence for women. Very radical for the times. Angelina and Sarah Grimke of Charleston, South Carolina, were early Southern activists in anti-slavery and women's rights. They came from a slave-holding home located right across the street from a slave market on the wharf. Angelina married Theodore Dwight Weld, an active abolitionist. She became an inspirational speaker for abolitionist and women's causes. Sarah never married, but wrote letters on the equality of the sexes and the condition of women. She argued that God created woman equal to man, and there were no separate spheres for men and women. Women could do any work and have any education, be active in politics as much as any man. Both were exiled from South Carolina and were often ridiculed and physically threatened when they held public meetings, since it went against God for women to publicly speak. Another prominent proponent of women's rights was Sojourner Truth. She was born in New York to Dutch American owners. Her real name was Isabella Baumfree, and she spoke Dutch. New York started to abolish slavery in 1799, but that was not completed due to a variety of regulations until 1827. Throughout this period, Isabella had 4 owners. She gave birth to 5 children. She walked away from her last owner with her baby daughter because he broke a promise to free her. She sought refuge with an abolitionist couple who paid $20 for her freedom. She changed her name in 1843 as a result of a spiritual experience and became an ardent abolitionist speaker. At the 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, she gave the "Ain't I a Woman Too" speech. She didn't say those exact words, and with the Southern slave speech pattern, but she spoke up for African American women's rights as being as important as white women's rights at a time when black women were invisible. At the American Equal Rights Association meeting in 1867, she said, "Man is so selfish that he has got women's rights and his own too, and yet he won't give women their rights. He keeps them all to himself." Frederick Douglass, the famous African American abolitionist, was also a lifelong supporter of women's rights, and particularly suffrage. He was the only African American to attend the 1848 Seneca Falls Conference. He stated there, "In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world." His speech moved the convention members to pass the woman suffrage resolution. He and 31 other men in attendance signed the Declaration of Sentiments written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which demanded political, social, legal, and religious rights for women. Later we will see how he split with Stanton over the issue of the 15th Amendment. A new face entered the suffrage movement in 1853, Susan B. Anthony. Stanton and Anthony formed a 50-year relationship in the fight for women's suffrage. Anthony was a moderate compared to the more radical Stanton. She was unmarried but loved children. Her young suffragists lovingly called her Aunt Susan. She was a woman of action. Stanton said, "I forged the thunderbolts," the ideas and plans, and she fired them. The Civil War cut into the work of the suffragists. With the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, Anthony and Stanton turned their total efforts to the freeing of the slaves. They formed the Women's Loyal National League. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the Confederacy, not those states which had not seceded. The League called for all African Americans in all states to be free and mounted a petition drive, which women could legally do, collecting over 500,000 signatures that Senator Charles Sumner used to get the 13th Amendment passed. He gave credit to the League for the Emancipation Amendment. The women used this experience as a lesson in swaying public opinion that they would carry into the struggle for women's suffrage. In 1866, the American Equal Rights Association was formed by Stanton, Douglass, and Anthony after the American Anti-Slavery Society refused to accept women's suffrage as a cause. In the fight to support the passing of the 15th Amendment, which only gave African American men the right to vote, a crack started to form among the members. The American Anti-Slavery Society strongly felt that the group should be supporting male suffrage only, leaving out females of all colors. The women themselves differed on the issue, causing dissension. Finally, a split occurred in 1869. Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 15th Amendment unless it was rewritten to add woman suffrage. They felt that if black men got the vote over white women, it was unacceptable. They started the National Woman Suffrage Association that worked on a national basis for women's suffrage and against the 15th Amendment. While there were racial overtones, such as aligning with rich racist George Francis Train for monetary support, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and the Purvis family and other African Americans stayed in the National Woman Suffrage Association. Frederick Douglass felt it was too risky to not support the 15th at this time. He reversed his 1848 views and said women had vicarious power to vote through their husbands and male family members. Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell, split off the National Woman Suffrage Association and formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, ASA, to work for suffrage for all on the state-by-state level. She supported the 15th, but felt that the suffrage for women was more important than suffrage for African Americans. The group also supported other women's rights. The national movement waned with the split. It was evident to Stone and Blackwell after failure to bring women's suffrage to Colorado in 1877 that a national effort by a political party for the vote was the only way. The groups merged in 1890 and became NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, a mostly white and urban group that promoted women's suffrage within state constitutions. Rural blacks and whites were not involved very much due to the long days of farm work, which provided no free time for such frivolous things when one was living hand to mouth. National, local, and state leadership started coming from the WCTU and women's clubs that had been working for other reforms in education, prison, and child labor. Women gained experience in these groups with legislatures and the public. The nation was changing too, and these changes impacted the woman suffrage movement. Industrialization brought people from farms and abroad to work in factories, increasing urban populations and decreasing rural. Due to this movement, societal changes took place. Service industries grew, employing mostly white men in middle-class income brackets that literally created the middle class. These men were sole breadwinners, and their wives no longer worked beside them on the farms. Their jobs were child-rearing and plus household duties. Most of them hired help, so the women had free time. More women became educated, at least up to 8th grade. In the growing middle-class sector, more women finished high school and went on to women's colleges or universities that allowed entrance. The white birth rate fell from an average of 7.04 children per family in 1800 to 3.56 in 1900. Urban living did not require children to run the farm. Black birth rates declined by 1880 as more moved to the cities for jobs. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, under Frances Willard's guidance from 1879 to 1898, was a formidable influence on the entire nation. By 1892, it had over 200,000 members. The movement was built upon the women's Protestant church groups and missionary societies. There also came to be a belief that a woman's duties lie in the home and family realm. Thus, for more and more women took up the cause to protect their families and were accepted by the public by this home protection doctrine. The WCTU is a catalyst for all types of women's projects. Under Willard, whose motto was "Do Everything," the WCTU tackled temperance, prison reform, child care for working mothers, federal aid to education, vocational training for women, kindergarten, the 8-hour workday, and women's suffrage. It was a training ground for organizing, legislative process, and public speaking for women. There were segregated unions in the South. In Alabama, the WCTU created a colored work department. They felt liquor was the enemy of African American families. By 1887, the 324 black WCTU members in Alabama contributed more to the national organization than the white groups with far more members. But by 1890, the black women turned more to the women's club movement. In the last decade of the 19th century, women's clubs developed nationwide out of the literary and educational societies. By 1918, they had over 1 million members, black and white. Alabama started the first state club in 1895. Like the WCTU, these women took up similar civic projects of reforming education, libraries, building hospitals, abolishing child labor, passing pure food and drug bills, and in 1914, women's suffrage. They were another training ground for organizing, funding, public speaking, and legislative process for suffragists. 2 African American Alabama women became very involved: Margaret Murray Washington and Adele Hunt Logan. Both were part of the Tuskegee Institute. Washington was the 3rd wife of Booker T. Washington and was co-founder and leader of the National Association of Colored Women. She and others were spurred by James W. Jacks, a white Southerner who claimed that Negroes in the country were wholly devoid of morality. The women were prostitutes and all were natural thieves and liars. These women's groups were bent on uplifting the race. They were middle-class, educated black women who started adult education programs, parenting programs, and home economic programs for rural blacks. Washington was moderate on the suffrage for women. She knew that whites didn't want black women to vote because they knew their votes could not be bought at any cost. Adele Hunt Logan came to Tuskegee in 1883. She was an ardent suffragist. She said, if white American women with all their natural advantages need the ballot, how much more do black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of a vote to help secure their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? The Alabama Federation of Colored Women's Clubs endorsed women's suffrage in 1909, and Logan took action to promote it in 1913. She gave speeches and wrote articles for suffrage in the NAACP's newspaper, The Crisis. By 1900, less than 10 states had universal suffrage, the ability to vote in all elections. Partial suffrage had been gained in some states, such as local elections, school board elections, and primaries. Notice that the West led the way in women's suffrage, with Wyoming granting suffrage in 1869. The Western states promoted women's suffrage as a way of enticing more people to move to these sparsely populated states, and thus increasing their power in Congress, especially in the House, plus by also gaining more electoral votes. Tactics by American suffragists had been moderate up to 1900. By 1912, younger women replaced the old leadership in NASA, and things started to radicalize. Younger NASA members like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns left NASA after March 1913 and formed the militant Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. Both had met in London, learning about more hard-nosed tactics such as picketing, parades, and hunger strikes. In 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized the women's suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. for Nassau. It was held on March 3rd, a day before Woodrow Wilson's inaugural, to put pressure on him, since he had influence over Congress. About 8,000 marchers were led by labor lawyer Inez Milholland, passing 500,000 spectators, mostly male. It was a segregated march, with the African American chapters marching in the rear. During the parade, Ida B. Wells and the other black marchers of Chicago moved up to march with the white Illinois chapters. Women were harassed by the crowd verbally and physically, and police did nothing to protect them. At places, the men crowded them so closely that only one marcher could get through at a time. It was a near riot. The cavalry at Fort Myers stepped in to restore order. Over 100 women were hospitalized. However, the parade mobilized more support for women, but it caused a split with the moderate women of Nassau. By 1916, women gained the presidential vote in 12 states, mostly in the West. The Congressional Union formed the National Woman's Party to run candidates in those states. Carole Chapman Cat was president of Nassau from 1900 to 1904 and 1915 to 1920. She had been trained by Susan B. Anthony and went on to lead the final battle for women's suffrage state by state. This strategy often led her to give in to racial prejudice with her speeches, depending on whether she was in the South, anti-black, urban East, anti-immigrant, or in the West, anti-Native American. But she felt all people had the right to vote. During World War I, she put aside her pacifist beliefs, which damaged her nationally, and supported the war effort, showing that suffragists were patriotic, and helped to advertise to the nation that women were working on munitions manufacturing, farming, and as nurses and ambulance drivers for the war effort. After the war, this effort changed the view of many Americans towards suffrage and led to the 19th Amendment under Wilson's encouragement, though he had to have his arm twisted figuratively. After World War I, public protests escalated. For 18 months, over 1,000 silent sentinels were sent by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns to peacefully and silently picket the White House to protest the wishy-washy position of Wilson. 500 women were arrested and 100 jailed over several months for obstructing traffic, which was a ruse to get rid of them. They persisted. Those jailed suffered terrible abuse in prison, with worm-infested food, dirty drinking water, sleep deprivation, and forced feeding during hunger strikes. On November 14, 1917, Lucy Burns was beaten in prison and chained to the bars overnight with her arms above her head. Dora Lewis was knocked unconscious. Alex Cuso suffered a heart attack. This became known as the Night of Terror. On November 27th and 28th, they were released. The public was appalled with their treatment by the authorities. 2 months later, Wilson announced a bill on women's right to vote. Alabama has many soldiers of women's suffrage. Patty Ruffner Jacobs came out of the women's clubs where she had a great interest in child labor law. She founded the Birmingham Equal Suffrage Association and the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. She was president of the Alabama State Association from 1912 to 16. She also served on the national board. She did give in to white supremacist views, advocating only for suffrage for white women. Frances Griffin was a teacher and WCTU speaker from Wetumpka, who became the first woman in the state to speak before a legislative body. At the 1901 Constitutional Convention, she eloquently presented reasons for women's suffrage. She stated, "The man without a vote is a subject, not a citizen. The woman without a vote is an inferior, not an equal." The men voted for suffrage, but then reneged on it the next day. Bossy O'Brien Hunley was an early member and president of the Birmingham Equal Suffrage Association. In 1914, she headed the statewide petition drive for a referendum on women's suffrage, gathering 10,000 signatures. She debated Congressman James Heflin in Wetumpka on the subject in front of thousands. Cotton Tom was not a supporter. Helen Keller was very outspoken on women's rights. She held modernist and socialistic views. She opposed child labor and supported birth control. In the 1915 New York Call, she wrote, "Today women are demanding rights that tomorrow nobody will be foolhardy enough to question." North Alabama had a long roster of women who carried on the suffrage struggle over several decades. Priscilla Holmes Drake came to Huntsville from Indiana with her husband right after the Civil War. He had business and social contacts with the New Harmony community of the Rapps and Robert Owen. It was very progressive on women's rights, suffrage, and birth control. They bought Avalon Plantation, currently the site of UAH. During that time, they set aside some land for the African American farmers to buy, or left an inheritance of the land. At that time, there was no support for women's suffrage, and Priscilla's efforts towards that were in vain. Ellen Stevens Hildreth was the wife of Christopher Hildreth, editor of the Decatur Advertiser. He ran an editorial column in 1890 promoting women's suffrage. In 1893, Ellen created the first local Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. She was president of the Decatur Association along with Frances Griffin as secretary. Alberta Chapman Taylor was the daughter of Governor Reuben Chapman. She was married to John Taylor and they moved to Colorado, a hotbed of women's suffrage. Her sister, Ella Lee Chapman Humes, lived in Huntsville and was a society leader and suffragist. Her husband was Milton Humes, a prominent attorney and part owner of the Montesano Dairy. In 1895, a collaboration between the Huntsville Political Equality Club and the Decatur Albany suffragists brought Susan B. Anthony and Carole Chapman Cat, who were on tour in the South before the NASA National Convention in Atlanta, to Madison County to give suffrage lectures. Two ladies spoke at the Eccles Opera House in Decatur and Huntsville City Hall to standing room crowds. Virginia Clay Clopton, a NASA officer on local, state, and national levels, introduced the speakers at the City Hall on January 29, 1895. The Weekly Mercury reported on the meeting the next day, noting that Mrs. Cat had been frequently and warmly applauded, and her address was pronounced a rare grand treat. A number of ladies and gentlemen went forward and enrolled their names as members. Previously to the talk, the Weekly Mercury had an editorial criticizing women's suffrage. The writer felt that women would be masculinized, knocking their way through uncouth crowds of men to vote. Alberta Chapman Taylor replied to the criticism in the Evening Tribune, arguing that women were highly intelligent and engaged in civic affairs, and have engaged in the march of civilization while he has been standing still. She went on to express that the women of Colorado are highly respected and were supported by businessmen and professionals. The early phase came to an end with the passage of the 1901 Constitution. Frances Griffin, president of the Alabama Woman Suffrage Association, invited by U.S. Senator Cotton Tom Heflin, spoke before the Alabama Constitutional Convention in 1901, asking for women's suffrage. She said, "Thus has not the condition of a woman changed from a ward to an agent of intelligence, where she touches the government all the way along her life, and the government touches her, and should she not have a share in it? As we said before, her efforts were in vain." This is an Alabama broadside or handout from the Equal Suffrage headquarters in Birmingham. Love the quote. It's based on no taxation without representation. This is from the Montgomery Southern Women's League for Rejection of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, the 19th Amendment. It warns about the feminization of men if they give women the vote. We are now going to take a closer look at the 1901 Constitution of Alabama, our current one that has created many voting barriers to Alabama citizens. This is the 6th Constitution. All but the 1868 Constitution were framed to protect the supremacy of wealthy planters, lawyers, and industrialists, allowing them to control and regulate participation in the political process. The Constitution of 1901 was written to disenfranchise black males without disenfranchising upper and middle class white males. It would enshrine white supremacy legally and shape Alabama politics to the present. The Constitution concentrated power in the state legislature, decreasing opportunities for home rule and establishing voter requirements that many white men could not meet, reducing the political influence of the state's poor whites. It was supported by the bourbon planters of the Black Belt and their mule allies of the rapidly industrializing Birmingham area. Poor white farmers and African Americans were in opposition, knowing they were losing any control they may have possessed. Local governments lost political power too. The 1901 Alabama Constitution, under Article 8, Sections 177 to 196, defined suffrage and election requirements and included both permanent and temporary registration plans. There were provisions for literacy tests, an employment time of 1 year, and stringent property qualifications. One could be disqualified for vagrancy, mental deficiencies, and moral failings. There was a grandfather clause with 3 exceptions within the temporary voter registration plan. It was for 1 year only, 1902 to 1903. Any adult male could register to vote if he proved he understood the U.S. Constitution, or he had been a veteran of any 19th century American war, or was descended from a veteran. Since very few African Americans have been allowed military service, this was extremely unfair. Poll taxes also controlled who would get to vote. The Constitution required all voters aged 21 through 45 to pay a cumulative poll tax of $1.50 every year to continue voting, a considerable sum for poor farmers and laborers, black or white. If you missed a year, you had to pay the missed years as well as the present. Individuals who paid another person's poll tax were guilty of bribery and lost their right to vote. During the 1901 Constitutional Convention, a group of Madison County suffragists, including Carole Chapman Cat and Alberta Chapman Taylor, and led by Virginia Clay Clopton and Frances Griffin, sent a petition to the convention asking for suffrage for women. They based their arguments for it on their rights as property owners and taxpayers. Frances Griffin was allowed to address the convention. Despite her eloquence and a just cause, the final vote to include a provision for women's suffrage was defeated. Cotton Tom Heflin dismissed the ladies as a few cranks strolling over the state. Because of this defeat, the group lost momentum and disappeared until 1910. As we have seen, reform efforts for African American women in the South began before the Civil War and continued as Northern black women moved south to work in the freedmen's schools. We have already discussed Martha Murray Washington and Adele Hunt Logan's work with the Tuskegee Institute Women's Club. Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell were two more such courageous women. Both were born into slavery and grew up in an increasingly oppressive, violent white culture, witnessing the tyranny and evil of local and state governments that kept black men from voting. Terrell was a graduate of Oberlin College in Ohio, a school that welcomed female students, black and white. She became a teacher. Her life changed radically in 1892 when her childhood friend Thomas Moss was lynched. From that point, she devoted her life to activism in education, voting rights, and equal opportunity for black women. She worked with NASA and the National Women's Party, but was unable to bring true integration into the women's suffrage movement. Ida Wells Barnett was a teacher, journalist, and printer. Her editorials about black school conditions while a Memphis teacher got her fired. She was also a friend of Thomas Moss and 3 others who were lynched. She published a protest essay, had her office burned, and was threatened. She moved north and began a career traveling the country, educating the public about the horrors of mob violence and lynching. She met with President Woodrow Wilson to promote a federal anti-lynching law. She was an ardent suffragist, as noted above, when she integrated the Illinois delegation marching in the 1913 women's suffrage procession. Racial lynchings began in 1877 in Alabama and did not end until 1944. There were 361 reported lynchings in the state. The entrenched Bourbons enforced the control through a combination of intimidating African Americans, raising the specter of black rule to keep whites within the party, and fraudulently counting votes for conservative candidates when all else failed. Carole Chapman Cat was president of NASA from 1900 to 1904 and 1915 to 1920. She had been trained by Susan B. Anthony and went on to lead the final battle for women's suffrage state by state. This strategy often led her to give in to racial prejudice with her speeches, depending whether she was in the South, anti-black, urban East, anti-immigrant, or in the West, anti-Native American. But she felt all people had the right to vote. During World War I, she put aside her pacifist beliefs and supported the war effort, showing that suffragists were patriotic, and helped to advertise to the nation that women were working on munitions manufacturing, farming, and as nurses and ambulance drivers for the war effort. After the war, this effort changed the view of many Americans towards suffrage and led to the 19th Amendment under Wilson's encouragement, though he had to have his arm twisted, figuratively, by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns' Silent Sentinels protesters. Ratification was finally put to the states with Wilson's encouragement. The final battleground for ratification was Tennessee. The first 35 states came very quickly into the women's suffrage fold. The Tennessee Senate passed the amendment, but the House stalled. Cat worked to exhaustion to persuade legislators to pass it, as did Sue Shelton White, Alice Paul's protege. Women were dispatched to all parts of Tennessee to lobby for its passage. The vote to pass came down to one man, Harry T. Byrne, who wore an anti-red suffrage rose in his lapel. But he voted aye to pass the amendment. When asked why, he told them his mother had written him a note to vote for it. Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. I noticed some of the speeches against. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat out the rats in ratification. On August 26, 1920, The 19th Amendment giving women the vote was certified by the United States Secretary of State and became law. Alabama then called a special session of the state legislature and passed its own amendment to the Alabama Constitution. They were worried about challenges to Alabama's voting system and the risk of losing oppressive structure they had built in 1901. Alabama officially ratified the 19th Amendment on September 8, 1953. We hope you enjoyed part 1 of the presentation, The Struggle to Vote, the Nation, Alabama, and the South, 1848 to 1920. Please join us for part 2 that covers the continuing struggle for full citizenship for women and minorities.